Hey guys, welcome back to another 25 Days at Disney. I'm Julia.
And I'm Jennifer.
And today we're here to talk about how Disney Pixar's animation has evolved over the years from starting back all the way in 1995. So let's go at it.
Hey Stub Clubbers, like we said, welcome back to another 25 Days of Disney. If you've not subscribed to our channel and you're a new Stub Clubber, make sure you subscribe. Hit the notification bell so you're always notified when our 25 Days of videos go live, or when we're done with 25 Days of Disney, other videos that come out. We are also on Facebook and we're on Instagram, so make sure you hit us up on those social media pages as well.
So as you guys know, Toy Story came out in 1995, and that was considered a Pixar masterpiece at the time because it was a big accomplishment of just creating a full-length animated film in the Pixar studios. Now, interestingly, we're talking about how the Pixar animation specifically has evolved from then. So a perfect example of this is, obviously we're talking about in Toy Story 1995, that was the first one. If you compare the first initial Toy Story to the second one in 1999 to the third one in 2010 all the way to the fourth one, which I believe was in 2019, you can see drastic differences in animation. Now obviously from like 2010, 2019, even though that's a 9-year difference, animation was still similar with the Pixar studios because it was already at its height and they've continued off of it. When you take a look at the first Toy Story, now we've talked about this actually in our other video with Cars. Brian mentioned it was quite scary how they had humans looking, like the little baby.
It really was.
So Pixar was not, they didn't hone the skill of perfecting a animated human. They did what they could do with it, and then they kind of used ways to avoid showing it in the film.
Yes, they did.
So if you take a look in the first Toy Story, I know a scene in the Pizza Planet, they would show all these kids running around. They would dim the lighting. They didn't want to fully light the humans in it because they didn't perfect them. They weren't all, fully animated.
Same with Andy's mom. And the Pizza Planet driver.
So what did they do? They showed the arm of them driving. They would show from the perspective of what the toys were seeing, an arm, maybe Andy's mom's feet with the shoes coming in while they're under the bed or something like that. So they would find ways that they fully didn't have to show the humans. Obviously, we did see Andy in it. And you could take a look at Andy in 1995's Toy Story. 1999, it's a little bit more improved, but then when you take a look, obviously he's aged and grown up in the third Toy Story, you could see that was at its height of how they were fully able to perfect human.
If you look at their faces, they are round, they're human-like, but there's something like
robotic.
Flat, robotic, awkwardness.
Yes.
Not very smooth. Like there's something that's going on with it that you can tell, just like the way that they did the planes on the face. Different things you could tell is very different.
Yes. So what we're really talking about is how Pixar has been able to build off of their achievements from one film onto the other to perfect their skills and build off of those past achievements, and you'll see them in future films. So as we talked about, beginning with Toy Story, they didn't have it down with animating humans.
Right.
They went on to Bug's Life, and they were able to, not with humans obviously in that, but they tackled like smoothness in it, and they said that was a component with animating that they needed to sharpen their skills off of to go from there.
You're right, because like the way how all the ants are
right.
Like, the ladybug, all of those different insects, and even their surroundings, you're right, they tried to work on those other areas, so the smoothness. I just feel like in general they were working on to the smoothness of how they moved. There was more smooth swiftness that would go on, I feel like, in Bug's Life than Toy Story a little bit.
They're more stiff, I want to say.
Yeah.
So before they fully tackled a full-length human movie, 2004 Incredibles, they went on and did Monsters, Inc. next. So Monsters, Inc. gave them the opportunity to tackle fur. So on Sully, he has all the hairs, thousands of hairs on his body. They had to do several tests just to perfect that for the movie. So originally, Mike Wazowski, the green guy, he only had legs originally in the test. They did like a screen test. They made him with legs, and Sully was originally this brown monster with tentacles, and they didn't really have a lot of fur on him. As they were doing the screen tests, when Sully has the tentacles on him, they didn't like it because they're like, can we do a 2-hour movie having these tentacles walking across the floor? Too much focus was going with the eye to his tentacles. So they completely scrapped that. Then they started just building off of creating Sully. They made him blue, and they added all the hairs and the fur. The creators knew that was going to be a challenge with the fur, so therefore they did a ton of tests. So they made him go through, like, say, an obstacle course. So this was all animation. Sully, they already had all his furs, everything as you see him now, his final finished animation. As they were having him go through the obstacle, he would go, up and down through things. His fur with the program, it would stretch, things would get caught.
Or like as he would brush up against something, maybe like his fur would bend backwards and go back.
So they had to do several of those tests and perfect in a program they had a specialist with tools to be able to have him run through everything and have the movements match, and the fur wasn't getting caught, so they're able to perfect that. So, they got, like, exiled from the monsters world, and when they have Sully fall into the snow, they had to put thousands of tiny little snowflakes and attach it onto his fur hairs, and it all had to reflect with how was the wind blowing, how was he laying on the snow to know how much snow should appear on which parts to be realistic. So they really had to spend during that movie time to perfect it. They also even had just to test fur ball at the beginning. They just made this fluffy round fur ball, and they would do, okay, let's have it, if it was like silky and fuzzy, how would the hair move around? If it was all wet and damp, how would the hair move around?
And another thing you could say that by doing Bug's Life first before Monsters, Inc. is by them doing all of the insects and the smoothness. A lot of that comes into play with all these different types of monsters. So Mike's skin, when you do scales, all of this stuff they were working on during Bug's Life, and then it transitioned into this movie.
It's true, because the bugs were all, like, you could say bare. They're all just the kind of scaly, plain ant skin, whatever ants have.
And you could say
they added fur, added this to make the monsters.
And with the fur, you could say that some of the insects as well, they could have been starting to test some of the hairs on some insects, like with...
because they also had a bird in Bug's Life.
So they have the bird. If there's, like, the grass, like, Hopper and his gang, or the little, flea circus, there's a couple of hairs on them, so you could say that they also started working with hair movement more from Bug's Life too.
It's true, and this is jumping, as they were able to perfect the fur in Monsters, Inc., they used that same skill when they made Ratatouille with having all the rats with their fur, and there's different fluffiness and elements that they knew how to already work with. Same with Up. They had the dogs, the bird with the feathers. So those were just movies down the line that Pixar was able to take what they learned
and prepare
and accomplished in earlier films to be able to create it down the line in later films. So moving down the line, Pixar created Finding Nemo in 2003. That took a long, long time for them to create.
I bet that had to.
This film, they had to tackle the concept of how to make water.
Reflections.
Wetness. So that's exactly right. They had to tackle the different elements of water and the different environments. I'm not sure if it was the creator or somebody wanted they told everybody working on the film, you need to get certified in scuba diving.
Oh, really?
They said, how can we make a movie about an underwater world without you having experienced it first?
Which, it's true, and that is a Disney tradition, because there's a lot of movies that they would bring, like, the real animals into the studio, like with Bambi. Walt wanted people to, like, look at the real animals first so they would understand how you're supposed to do the movement of the legs, so it made sense for them, for Finding Nemo, to have them scuba dive first to get the experience of being that far down, maybe at the bottom, seeing how the movement of the water is, maybe with just the camera, if they would take an underwater camera, so then they could say, well, how can we transition this from real to animation?
So speaking of how they wanted to work with water, they had to show, how the beams of light would go through. It also depended on what time of day it was in the film. Was it nighttime? Was it dawn? They had to consider other elements like just the type of water. Was it sewage water? Mm-hmm. Was it did we want the clear, open, blue ocean feeling? Mm-hmm. Was it murky harbor water? There was so many different elements to take into account of the type of water they wanted to portray in the scene with the mood and the lighting. Mm-hmm. There was so much to it. And they said at one point, off of their scuba diving experience, because there's moments in the film where they wanted to make it look like you're underwater, like just underwater. Mm-hmm. So they had to do the light and play with it. Like kind of like when you're underneath in a swimming pool and you look up and can tell you're underwater. They said at one point, they got the water to look, they said, this is good, but hey, wait a minute, this is too realistic. And they said, we want the viewer to believe that this exists, believe this water is here, but we also want you to feel like you're in a make-believe world.
That's a little bit what Brian talked about with Cars, how he said that or Pixar in general, that they're starting to get to currently where it's
too realistic.
And he says, well, you want to be in an animated world. Mm-hmm. And he's like, well, I don't care about all the threads on Mr. Incredible's shirt, this and that. They're moving towards that now where Brian's like, this is too realistic. And it goes along with what you just said. It was too realistic, so let's make sure it's animated.
Yeah, because there's a point where when you were back in Toy Story, the humans... if it looks too like robotic or unrealistic, that's not what they want to go at.
Or too plasticky or something.
Yeah, so it's like on a spectrum of you don't want it too simple or too robotic or too unrealistic, but you also don't want it where it's like, oh, this is a live feature film. This is a real looking fish.
Right.
You want it kind of somewhere in the middle of that spectrum, which is what they were trying to do. So that's where they had to go back and get that goal. So that's why it took a long time. Mm-hmm. But being able to, what they did in Finding Nemo with water reflections and light bouncing off of water or reflections, later on when they made Cars, they kind of took off that experience of, okay, now we have to make light reflect off of metal. And we need to make Lightning McQueen appear shiny on these metal surfaces. We need this grass to be, I think from what they did in Finding Nemo with some of the coral or some of the anemone, how it flows like that. Mm-hmm. And then in Cars, they have like the grass flowing. Mm-hmm. So elements like that later came along.
Maybe even like when Lightning McQueen is drifting with the dirt, even just the movement of the dirt and the dust clouds probably came into play from what they were learning being underwater.
That's true, yeah. And at one point, some of the creators said, if you want to work at Pixar, you got to know physics. You can't just be an artist. You got to know, because it's the concept of they said, what was the one they said, like water is denser than air, and you need to know how, because to make it look realistic to the point that they wanted it to be, it had to make sense in real life how certain things in physics, how things work. Mm-hmm. So it has to make sense. Just like with Monsters, Inc., they said with Sully's hair, while he's walking, just the weight of his hair and the movement has to match like a real life animal and how his hair is, because then it won't, it's to the point where it is, you want to feel like you're in a make-believe world, but it also has to kind of make sense what's going on with how things move and work as it does in the real world.
So
as I mentioned in Cars, when they had to work with metal surfaces and reflections, they further took up, that accomplishment into 2008's Wall-E, to also have metal surfaces and rust. And again, I didn't really see Wall-E because it honestly didn't spark my interest too much. But that kind of was more, Wall-E had he was a machine, like a car. So that made sense of building off of that. And I said too with Ratatouille with the fur, they took Monsters Inc. fur expertise and their expertise of the water that they created in Finding Nemo to come together, and they were able to successfully create the wet fur on the rats
when they're in the sewers.
Yes, exactly.
And anything in the kitchen that would go on.
Yes. When you go down to 2017's Coco, they had about
that's already that many years old.
Yeah, it's been out several years.
See, I keep thinking like it's only like 3 years old or something. When
it's been out a couple years. So they had millions and millions of lights in that, with Day of the Dead and when they cross over to the other world. They also mentioned that a lot of the characters that wore clothes in Coco were skeletons. And the animators found that while simulating the clothing, the cloth would often get caught between the individual bones. And the clothing, creating like a wedge. So they had to use techniques, more technical jargon, but they had to use something with continuous collision detection just so that the bones and the clothing wouldn't get in the way. Kind of the same way when they were doing their test runs for Monsters, Inc., that his fur, when it interacted and hit objects, wouldn't get caught. Because, again, we don't know how any of these animation programs work unless you're an expert. But there's things they have to do with tools, and they have to do different programming to get whatever animated character they're making to cooperate in its environment.
This is Hector's costume. Pixar's had years of experience making digital clothing, but we've never clothed skeletons before. And we knew that Hector would be one of the most difficult ones because he shows so much bone. So it's just very difficult to cheat. So how do we make cloth drape over bones? There are many gaps and holes for the cloth to fall into and get stuck. But Lee was always asking us to embrace the skeletonness. Lee really wanted to see the definition of the bones that was under the clothing. So a collision body was created, which contained a sealed up rib cage, but we kept the rib separation to really embrace the skeleton, but we fused the radius and the ulna and the tibia and fibula on the legs. And besides the collision issues, there were still a lot of skeleton-specific problems that we needed to solve, like the floating kneecaps or the gaps between the bones. So if you take a look at Hector's knee on the right, you can see the cloth getting bunched up in there. The solution was to fuse the joint gaps with cloth, which prevented the cloth from falling in there and getting stuck.
Right. Basically, a way to think of it is when they're animating something, almost think of like a roller coaster. You have the car and you have the track, and the car needs to go over parts of the track. With clothing, if you have it with the bones of the people in Coco, you can't have it where, the clothing being the roller coaster and the bones being the track, it's going to all of a sudden get stuck on an area. So they probably have to make sure when they're animating it, there's like a smooth curve or do something that we can't see underneath it, so then it will slide instead of just getting stuck and then not being able to project forward.
Exactly. Well said. Taking a look at, so we had Incredibles in the early 2000s, and then the second one came out 2000, I don't know what year it was, but even then, if you probably were to compare how the characters were, I know they especially mentioned Jack. They were able to just like enhance, they said, his cuteness of, I don't know, with his eyes or something with his animation that, because we're talking later in the teens of the 2000s versus the early 2000s, just of how Jack looked. And I'm sure there were differences in the other elements. And as Brian mentioned once, Mr. Incredible shirt and all the details and the knit.
Well, basically, you could just say that Pixar, the animators got better at their craft. So they were able to have maybe instead of the eyes looking like plastic or glass, they could work on how can we do the reflections better so it's more of a subdued reflection. Even like with their skin, how can we make it look more softer than like plastic looking, like in the first Toy Story?
Yeah, because when you look at the humans in Inside Out, very like with the skin, the softness, the smoothness, realism, it's all there. And when you compare Riley in Inside Out and her parents as compared to Andy and his parents, when they even show the mom barely in the earlier films, it's such a drastic difference. And that's a complete, really good example of the evolution of how animating has gone with Pixar Studios. Taking it down to Toy Story 4 in 2019, I know for a while we didn't see Bo Peep because she really wasn't in the third one.
Right.
When you look at Bo Peep in Toy Story 4 versus the first and second one, that is a prime example. They made her in Toy Story 4 have even more of like a porcelain doll-like appearance. I would say she looks more like glass, like I said, porcelain, as where the 90s version of Bo Peep would look more plasticky.
Yeah, I recently just watched Toy Story, the first one, and...
Oh, did you?
Yeah, I did. Peep really is the example of, it was like a wet plastic look. It was this like sharp glazed look that would happen over Bo Peep, where it was more subtle in the fourth one. Plus, also you can tell the way they animated her face, because that's a character they haven't touched in so long. It has completely changed, even like the structure, like the cheekbones, everything.
Her eyes were very, very differently animated.
The other thing too is I don't understand specifically how these animated programs work. When you have something that has been made within the last several years and they have made sequels or third ones, for example, they will have all of their generated codes and stuff in these programs. And they're going to be, if they are still on that system or an updated version of that software, they can re-input those codes and they have the stuff's like all ready to go. So they will have the basic movements, all of that, but they will just advance and perfect it. But when you had that big gap from 99 to 2010, that is such a big gap that technology in itself changed, that there's a chance that those programs, maybe if it was the same, weren't compatible anymore. They had to probably generate codes where it wasn't even like similar anymore.
It's like when you try to use your old Roller Coaster Tycoon now on the computer.
Yeah.
Incompatible.
Right. Or when you're trying to, because there's many programs where you can bring in certain files into another program. If it's not compatible, it won't even load into that program.
Yep.
So, you know, you're thinking of like, they probably had to start from scratch when it came to some of these films when they didn't touch them for a while because of just the way how technology works. Years ago, of course, it's just redrawing stuff over and over again. Or you know how they say they're reusing some animated features by just like tracing over some old stuff. But yeah, it's a completely different ballgame when it comes to technology.
So another interesting evolution with Pixar was in the Toy Story series. In the fourth one, we got introduced to Ducky and Bunny, and they were starring roles. They were adorable. What were they? They were stuffed animals. They were fluffy. Now, they were able to make Ducky and Bunny starring roles in Toy Story 4 because, again, Pixar was building off of, hey, we know how to do fur. We know how to make them fluffy.
And we can have them in a lot of frames that it'll be okay with it.
Because we did this in Monsters, Inc., and we did a pretty damn good job of it. So we can do it in we can do it in Toy Story 4 and bring them in as main characters. Now, if you're talking, they try to do this in Toy Story 1 or even Toy Story 2 with stuffed animals. I can't even think of like a toy that was really a stuffed animal in it, but they wouldn't have been able to do it like that because they hadn't even reached in the 90s. They didn't have their experience with Monsters, Inc. yet. None of that. So I don't think they would have been able to make Bunny and Ducky in the 90s and appear all fluffy.
I think they actually did, when you really do look back, a lot of their toys were always plastic or metal. Yep. When it came to
Mr. Potato Head,
Mr. Potato Head, Rex, Ham.
They had dolls, like they had Woody and Jessie,
but they had dolls. Plastic hair.
Yeah, right. Bullseye is a perfect example. He's a
fabric.
Yeah, he's a horse in it, but he's fabric, and they didn't have him have like a mane of hair that was all like flowing.
But that you could say is that's when they started getting more into fabrics and material, which if you look at the bed for Andy's bed, that quilt, when they show Woody transitioning into Buzz Lightyear bedding, it looks very different. So with all the dolls that Sid's sister had, those hairs were so stiff. It was almost like they purposely on the dolls had like yarn hair and stuff. Like all the dolls at the tea party, anything when Sid would take their heads off and put them on other things, it was always very, very stiff. Because they didn't know, it was more like they knew how to move chunks, but they didn't know how to move like free-flowing like 20 things at a time, which is, you know, what they needed to perfect with maybe certain insects in Bug's Life. In Monsters, Inc. with Boo's hair, they were probably starting to really try to get into that with the fur of Sully, going into the Incredibles hair in the first one. Now, you will see definitely still with Incredibles 2, they got so progressively better with the hair. That's why they were able to make it more free-flowing. So probably like if you look at Elastigirl's hair in the first one and Elastigirl's hair in the second one, as she's like on the motorcycle and flipping around, her hair is probably more free-flowing to look more natural, where they can probably move thousands of strands at once, when before they were probably just moving like the chunks.
It's true. So
same with Violet and Dash when he would run. They were probably able to make it look more like fluffier moving too, just from that all of that progressive work that they have done, and they scaffold and built off of each other constantly.
Yeah, so that's our discussion, you know, on how Pixar has evolved over the years, and they've just, like you said, they've been able to just, it's a craft that they've gotten better and better at, and they've been able to do more and expand on their films. So tell us any comments you have or anything you've noticed in the Pixar films over the years that you'd like to point out based on how Pixar has evolved and has grown and built off of its previous achievements to make even better films. See you next time, guys, for another 25 Days of Disney.